Hi, everybody. Um, Welcome to the carbon cycle stream for AP Environmental Science on Fiveable. Just a couple of things before we get started. First of all, I'm Jessie Howington, and I'll do a little bit more of an introduction in a minute. But don't forget to check out Fiveable on all of the social media channels. We got Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and Vimeo. All right, so just a quick overview before we get started. Let's see here. This is my first time doing a stream after my sample stream, so I'm still getting used to the technology, so bear with me, please. So just a quick overview for you guys. Over to the side is the chat window, and I'll be able to see any questions that you guys put in there, or any answers to questions that I ask that you respond in there. Down at the bottom, there is a spot where you can ask questions. So if you have a question that you want me to answer a little bit later, you can type it there, and then I can tag it in the video, and we can have that recorded for everybody. So all right. So I am a high school environmental science teacher, and I have taught APES for 6 years now. And it's my favorite subject of all times, because I really like going outside and playing in the dirt, and in the water. So tonight we're going to talk about, so that was your introduction to me. You guys give me a shout out over here in the chat and maybe give me an emoji of how you're feeling about APES tonight. Okay. Am I doing this right? Okay. So tonight we are going to talk about the carbon cycle. So we're going to go over all of the steps in the carbon cycle. All right, I'm just doing a quick check in the chat to make sure you guys can hear everything okay, make sure I don't need to change any settings. And maybe you're just being shy. Okay, great, thank you. Excellent. All right, so back to our overview. We're gonna go over the steps in the carbon cycle. You guys get to see my awesome artistic skills, and you will see very quickly why I am a science teacher and not an art teacher. And then we'll talk more specifically about the reservoirs in the carbon cycle, or the sinks in the carbon cycle. We'll talk about some important chemical reactions in the carbon cycle, how humans have influenced it, and if we have time at the end, depending on what you guys, how many questions you guys have, we might have some time to be able to cover the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle as well, pretty quickly. So that's what we're going to cover in this stream. And then the bigger picture, the carbon cycle relates back to some of the bigger recurring things that we talk about in AP Environmental Science, including climate change, which is a big one for us, and also ecosystem ecology. So how those organisms interact with each other, and also with the abiotic factors. All right, so the first thing that we need to know is what is the carbon cycle? Who knows? So it's defined as the movement of atoms and molecules containing the element carbon between sources and sinks. So that's the College Board's definition. And I'm sure your textbook has a pretty similar definition. So all essential elements and all essential compounds are created of matter, and one of the law of conservation of matter says that matter can't be created or destroyed. It can just change forms or change into energy. So it's cycled. So that's where these cycles come from. All right, so to start off with, for our carbon cycle, the biggest sink or reservoir of carbon that there is in the atmosphere. So we have lots of carbon dioxide floating around in the atmosphere. We say lots, but really it's like less than 1% of the total types of gases that are in the atmosphere. If you guys remember, or maybe you don't remember, like about 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen N2 gas, about 21% is oxygen, which we need, and so do other living organisms to do respiration. And then 1% of more or less the atmosphere is made up of all sorts of different gases, including argon and carbon dioxide and lots of other things that are floating around, methane. So we talk about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere a lot in AP Environmental Science, but it's actually a very small composition of a small part of the atmosphere, but it has a really big role and a really big impact on us. So carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, and then plants like trees and grass and algae in the ocean and in bodies of water, they do photosynthesis and convert that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into glucose. Bigger plants like trees that live for hundreds of years, those can be considered sinks for carbon, because once they turn it into glucose, they then convert that glucose into plant tissue where they're storing that carbon. So carbon dioxide leaves the atmosphere by through photosynthesis a lot of times, and then also just in water, just by regular absorption. So when waves interact with the air, that carbon dioxide will kind of dissolve in the water, and it dissolves into carbonic acid. So, and then glucose, after carbon has been photosynthesized and turned into glucose, it then goes through the food web. So we have our lovely herbivore here, a bunny rabbit, that eats the grass, and then our carnivore here that eats our little bunny rabbit. I'm sure you guys are seeing now why I do not teach art. And in the ocean, same thing. So it's cycling through the food web. And that carbonic acid that we talked about from the carbon dioxide just dissolving into the water, it's very unstable, and so it dissociates. And normally that's part of a buffer system in keeping the pH of the ocean relatively stable around a pH of 8. So the ocean is slightly basic. But so much carbon dioxide has dissolved into the ocean that there are lots of those carbonic acid molecules floating around. And so they have started to raise the pH of the ocean, which is now leading to ocean acidification. It is one of the biggest sinks of carbon in the carbon cycle. Because it gets stuck, because it just dissolves into the water, also because the carbon in the food webs sticks around for a really long time. So we're going to talk in a minute about how organisms, like once they eat their food, then eventually all things die and decompose. And then in the ocean, that dissolving organic matter takes a really long time to float down to the bottom of the ocean, and then it gets stuck in the sediments there. And so carbon that gets into the ocean stays there for a really long time. All right, so there's that picture there. So all these things die, the little particles will sink down, and then as these organisms when they're living, they're all doing respiration. So these organisms in the ocean, these organisms over here, they're all doing respiration, even the plants. And so they are converting that glucose into cellular energy. And as they're doing that, they are creating the waste product of carbon dioxide, which is then released back out into the atmosphere. So this is kind of a little mini cycle here within the bigger carbon cycle. All right, we talked about the organisms dying and decomposing. Those decomposers are also doing respiration, cellular respiration, so they are also emitting carbon dioxide back out into the atmosphere. When organisms die and they are not fully decomposed, especially with plant matter, that can be buried and they can become fossils. Or if the conditions are just right, then they could become fossil fuels like coal or oil or natural gas. So if those undecomposed organic bits of plants and animals sink down and they get covered in layers of sediment, probably in some body of water, then that might become a fossil fuel. And generally that is a huge sink of carbon as well. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So for the most part, without people in the picture, this is very balanced. It cycles in and out. The carbon that is leaving organisms from respiration is pretty much being taken up by plants doing photosynthesis. How's everybody feeling so far? Can you give me a thumbs up if you're feeling good in the chat, or a thumbs down if you're confused and need to slow down? Excellent. Thank you, Dakota. All right, so that was the carbon cycle without people. If you guys want to keep trickling in your responses, that would be lovely. So now adding in people, because we are organisms too, and we live here on Earth. So we are very, very dependent on extracting those fossil fuels in our society. So that huge store of carbon that had been there for a very, very, very long time, like hundreds of thousands of years, if not maybe millions of years, had taken to form and be stored in the ground, all of that carbon there. We're now extracting it. And we've been extracting it since the late 1800s, since about the Industrial Revolution. So we're extracting all that fossil fuel, and then we are, let's see here. And then we are using it in like power plants to create electricity. So like a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas-fired power plant. We use it directly to heat our homes and to cook food. We put gasoline in, which is refined petroleum, in our cars, and we burn that. And that is releasing carbon dioxide very, very quickly. So this carbon that was stored down here in the fossil fuels as a hydrocarbon chain, that is being extracted and combusted, and then that remaining carbon dioxide is being released into the atmosphere. So the cycle that was pretty balanced, we've now kind of unbalanced it, because we're taking all of this that took hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years, to be stored in the ground, and within a couple hundred years, we're taking a lot of it out of the ground and putting it back into the atmosphere really quickly. All right, so that's the basic overview of the carbon cycle. Do you guys have any questions? Okay, so I prepared a couple of polls. We'll see if I can get them to work. Okay. All right, so there's a couple of polls down here in the bottom, 3 of them. So if you guys want to go ahead and answer those poll questions. So which of the following is a sink in the carbon cycle? Is it grasses, the atmosphere, or coal-fired power plants? Go ahead and submit your votes. A couple of you already jumped the gun and submitted, and were ahead of the game and submitted your vote for our second poll. So which of the following is a sink in the carbon cycle again? Motor vehicle, algae, or fossil fuels. So remember, this is fossil fuels like in the ground still. And which of the following is a product of photosynthesis? Our choices are glucose, carbon dioxide, or ATP, or cell energy. So go ahead and chime in on those. Yay! All right, so I think there's only 4 of you here. So all 4 of you answered that the atmosphere is a sink in the carbon cycle. Good job, guys. That is correct. All right, and then which of the following is a sink in the carbon cycle? We're changing our answers. I love it. The motor vehicle, algae, or fossil fuels. And remember, that's fossil fuels that are still in the ground. Hint, hint, hint. So 3 of you answered fossil fuels that are still in the ground. So that's the right answer. Good job, guys. The algae can become a sink in the carbon cycle if it sinks down to the bottom of the ocean and is stored there in sediments or in fossil fuels. So good job there. And which of the following is a product of photosynthesis? And 4 of you guys said glucose, so good job for that one. All right. Do you guys have any other questions? Go ahead and type them in the chat. If not, we'll move on to our reviewing our reservoirs in the carbon cycle. So, all righty. So you guys already answered that our reservoirs in the carbon cycle is the atmosphere. We talked about the ocean being one because of how big the ocean is. Carbon just stays there. And then also when the dissolved carbon that was once a part of living organisms kind of floats down to the bottom and gets trapped in those sediments, that's there for a long time. It's not coming up to the atmosphere anytime soon. And then old growth forest is technically a reservoir, but it's a shorter term reservoir than like the ocean or the atmosphere. So trees that are doing photosynthesis, they are creating glucose and then transferring that glucose over into cellular tissue. And there are trees that live hundreds of years. And so they have all that carbon trapped in them. And then sediments and soils, those are also sinks or reservoirs in the carbon cycle. And fossil fuels are also a reservoir in the carbon cycle. All right, so we have some important chemical reactions that we should know. Photosynthesis, so I think a lot of people who take APES have already taken biology, so the photosynthesis is usually a pretty quick review. But just in case you need it, we're taking plants and algae, things that have chlorophyll, are taking carbon dioxide and water and light energy, and then they're converting that into glucose and oxygen, both of which are very important for us and for all other living things. And then either from a plant or itself, if it's a plant, or an animal might eat a plant, or an animal might eat another animal, you're going to get that glucose in the organism and combine it with oxygen and do cellular respiration to create carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, which is our cellular energy. So a little bit of chemistry review. All right, and then the carbon dioxide dissolving in water to create the carbonic acid. So this is kind of a 3-part equation. So we mentioned that this was very unstable. So the water and carbon dioxide interact to create the carbonic acid. And then since that's an aqueous solution, it dissociates to create hydrogen ions and oh, nope, I'm forgetting the right name for it because sometimes I forget the name of chemical compounds. Yep. I think I forgot it. So, but anyway, that carbonic acid dissociates. And then the combustion reaction, so this is just the general combustion reaction. It very rarely, possibly never actually happens this cleanly with only methane and an oxygen. Sometimes that hydrocarbon chain is a lot longer, and you have maybe ethane or something else. But you have a hydrocarbon interacting with oxygen, and then that creates carbon dioxide and water, water vapor, and light and heat, because usually it's exploding something in combustion. All right. Any questions about chemical reactions? Okay, cool. All right, so as we discussed earlier, the carbon cycle kind of left to its own devices is pretty balanced. So you have the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then plants photosynthesize that and assimilate that into their plant tissue. That can then travel through other living organisms through the food web, and then all living organisms are doing respiration, and they're respiring that carbon back out into the atmosphere. Some of that carbon that was stored in plant tissues also is going to break down into organic matter that's part of the soil, which we'll touch on later when we get to talking about soil formation in a completely different video. And then people since the late 1800s, since the Industrial Revolution, have been impacting the carbon cycle pretty strongly, outside of just being living organisms that are participating in the food web. So we are influencing the carbon cycle pretty strongly when we extract and burn fossil fuels. So maybe through creating electricity, or by burning coal or natural gas, or when we put gasoline or diesel fuel into our vehicles, and then that combustion reaction makes our cars go. It's also very quickly taking that carbon that was stored deep underground and then releasing it out into the atmosphere very, very quickly. And then cutting down trees is another way that we have a big influence on the carbon cycle. So we cut down trees for lots of different reasons. So we cut down trees to make developments. So if we need to build houses or businesses somewhere, we oftentimes cut down trees. And so when that happens, you are releasing the carbon that was stored in the tree itself, depending on what you're doing with it. So if you are cutting it down and burning it, so that's a combustion reaction. So that's taking that stored carbon from the tree and releasing it back out into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. If the tree is just left there, maybe it's rotting and decomposing naturally, and bacteria are breaking that down, or fungus is breaking that down, and they're releasing both carbon dioxide because they're consuming the tree and doing cellular respiration to get energy for themselves. But a lot of times those bacteria are also releasing methane, which is a carbon and 4 hydrogens. And methane is about 30 times more powerful at warming than carbon dioxide is. So we always talk about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and how it's contributing to the greenhouse effect, which I'll touch on in a minute. But methane is a much stronger warming gas than carbon dioxide is. So in addition to releasing that carbon that was stored in those trees, it's also, just by cutting down trees or burning trees, removing plants that were taking the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in during photosynthesis. So we don't have that sink anymore. All right, so we mentioned the greenhouse effect, and so I just want to go over that to make sure we're all clear on the greenhouse effect. So the greenhouse effect is when the infrared radiation emitted by the Earth. So all bodies in space that are not frozen solid are emitting some sort of heat energy or infrared radiation. And so different gases in our atmosphere will trap infrared wavelengths of light and heat. And so, sorry, radiation, infrared, you can't see that, so it's not light. So carbon dioxide is one of those, methane is another one, nitrous oxide is another one, ozone is another greenhouse gas, water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So all of these gases in our atmosphere, they kind of like play interference with that infrared radiation that is being emitted by Earth, and it's trying to escape out into space. So that part right there is the greenhouse effect, when the gases in our atmosphere trap the infrared radiation that Earth is emitting. Now, that's just a small part of the bigger picture. So Earth gains some of its heat that it then bounces back out as infrared radiation from solar radiation. So some solar radiation comes in through the atmosphere, and it's a much shorter wavelength, so it gets past all of those gases a lot more easily than the infrared radiation does. The infrared radiation is a really long wavelength, and so it is traveling a lot slower and will run into those gases that we just talked about. Whereas the ultraviolet radiation, the UV radiation from the sun, and the visible light radiation from the sun is a much shorter wavelength, and so it's traveling at a very fast speed, and it can kind of dodge around all of those compounds and get in through the atmosphere. And then Earth's surface tends to be pretty dark in color, so it's absorbing a lot of that radiation, and it's heating up. And then some of the sun's radiation is bounced off clouds in the atmosphere, and it just goes straight back out into space. And some is bounced off shiny things like ice caps, and that goes straight back out into space as well. So that solar radiation never really plays a huge part in heating the Earth, because it just bounces straight back out into outer space. This radiation that Earth absorbs, it then kind of transfers it into a different wavelength and then emits it as infrared. But this is not technically part of, so this whole thing that we've been discussing with the solar radiation, that's not technically part of the greenhouse effect. The greenhouse effect is more isolated when our gases are trapping infrared radiation that Earth is emitting. Okay, that's all that I had on the carbon cycle. So those are the sources that I used, and you should check out Fiveable on social media. If you guys are interested, I have a couple of extra slides on the nitrogen cycle, the phosphorus cycle, and the sulfur cycle. We do not have any streams currently planned to cover those cycles. Are you guys interested in covering those tonight, or do you have a whole bunch of questions? So go ahead and respond in the chat. So Dakota wants to cover the other 3 cycles. Karen wants to cover the other 3 cycles. All right, here we go. All right. So these are drawings that I did a while ago for another video that I made. So remember, the basis for all of these cycles is that matter is not created or destroyed. It can only transfer forms. So in this case with nitrogen, nitrogen is super important because if you remember back to biology, nitrogen is the basis for creating proteins. So all of the amino acids are nitrogen based, and those are the little building blocks of the proteins. And our DNA has nitrogenous bases in the middle. So in those like rungs in the middle of that double helix, all the pieces of the actual like information are nitrogen based compounds. So nitrogen is super important to all living things, but there's only a limited amount of it, especially in forms that can be taken up by plants and animals, because a lot of the time, so like we talked about way back in the beginning of this cast, nitrogen a lot of times is just floating around in the atmosphere. 78% of our atmosphere is triple bonded into nitrogen. So that triple bond means that those nitrogen molecules are super happy, they're super secure, hanging out with each other. They really don't want to interact with anything else. But in order to, get them into the whole ecosystem, they kind of have to break apart and be turned into other compounds. So the nitrogen cycle comes into play. So that N2 can be broken apart by lightning. So if there's like a lightning strike during a thunderstorm, and that will split those apart and kind of help that nitrogen get into the soil and interact with other compounds in the atmosphere. The other way, the main way that nitrogen gets into the ecosystem is through nitrogen fixation. So bacteria that are just like chilling in the soil all by themselves can fix nitrogen. So they'll interact with the air and do some cool chemical reactions. And then they'll turn it into forms that plants can uptake. Or there's some super cool plants that have some of these awesome nitrogen fixing bacteria that just hang out on their roots as a symbiotic relationship. So the plant kind of gives them a little bit of extra food when it does cellular respiration or not cellular respiration, when it does photosynthesis. And so those bacteria get some extra glucose, and the bacteria are fixing that nitrogen so that the plant can take it up and be super efficient. So the nitrogen fixation happens, and then nitrification happens. So it goes from the N2, it turns into ammonium, and then nitrite, and then nitrate. And so this whole process that takes a couple of different kinds of bacteria in the soil can just happen with these cool, awesome bacteria that live on the roots of the plant, like right there. So these plants, so these are usually bean and pea plants or legumes. They've got it made in the shade right there. After the nitrogen has been fixed, gone through ammonification and nitrification, then it can be assimilated into plant tissue, usually. So the plant will take it up and turn those nitrates that are floating around in the soil into proteins and use it in its DNA and all that fun stuff. And then it goes through the food web into our herbivores and on through the food web. And then eventually everything dies, as is the circle of life. And then the bacteria and the fungi and the soil help that plant tissue go through ammonification, and then it enters the cycle again. So it just kind of shortcuts that nitrogen fixation part. So you have like a cycle within a cycle here. And then sometimes when you have really wet soil conditions, like in a wetland or like a marsh, if you're near the ocean, there's some bacteria that in the soil that can do denitrification. So they'll take that nitrate and then they'll transform it back into the inert, into gas, and put it back out in the atmosphere. So our huge stores of nitrogen in the nitrogen cycle are in the atmosphere and then in the soil. So do you guys have any questions about the nitrogen cycle so far? I don't see any questions down here at the bottom. Nothing's popping up over there in the chat. If you have a question that I'm not answering, go ahead and ask it in that question, ask a question button at the bottom, and I'll get to it at the end. So back after, I believe it was World War I, we had a lot of nitrogen sitting around that we use as an ingredient in making bombs. And we figured out that you could also convert this into a compound that you could put on the soil, and that would help plants grow. Some guys named Haber and Bosch created this process. It's called the Haber-Bosch process, and it basically shortcuts the whole nitrogen cycle. It takes all of this part of the nitrogen cycle, the fixation and the nitrification, and just takes nitrogen from the atmosphere and turns it into a form that plants can take up really easily, those nitrates. And so that's how we got fertilizer. And so now we use a ton of fossil fuels to do this, because it's a really energy intensive process to fix nitrogen out of the air and to create fertilizers. But it's been really important in our agriculture. Because we figured out how to do this, we have been able to feed a bunch more people on Earth, like millions more people on Earth. That and a couple of other pieces of technology. So humans have been interfering kind of in the nitrogen cycle as well. So this is the nitrogen cycle. The picture there is a nitrogen cycle as it exists without people in it, or without people doing anything other than like eating and carrying out their normal life functions. But so we create fertilizer. Also, when we burn fossil fuels, that combustion reaction taking place in our atmosphere, that is 78% nitrogen, tends to create a lot of nitrates and nitrites during the combustion process, and that is released into the atmosphere. And so when nitrate is released into the atmosphere, that is a super, super powerful greenhouse gas. And it's about 200 to 300 times more powerful at warming the atmosphere than carbon dioxide is. So that's also bringing that back to the climate change thing. That also has an impact on that. Do you guys have any questions about the nitrogen cycle, how it exists normally, or how it exists with people having a hand in it as well? All right, I'm gonna create a poll since you guys will answer those. We're gonna say, what are ways that nitrogen is fixed out of the atmosphere? Give you some answers here. All right, here's a quick poll. What are the ways, or what is a way, sorry, that nitrogen is fixed out of the atmosphere? So organisms breathing, super awesome bacteria, or plants doing photosynthesis? So go ahead and chime in that poll. What is a way that nitrogen is fixed out of the atmosphere so that plants and animals can use it? No, we don't want to answer the poll. Think back to the lovely, lovely drawing. All right, well, I'll leave that there for you guys to answer while we move on and talk about the sulfur cycle. All right, so the sulfur cycle, volcanoes play a large part in the sulfur cycle, which inevitably makes it way more exciting. So we'll start with sulfur in the atmosphere. So we have sulfur dioxide that just chills out in the atmosphere, just like N2 floats around and carbon dioxide floats around in the atmosphere. So does a little bit of sulfur dioxide. So sulfur dioxide, let's see. So then it interacts with water and creates sulfuric acid and can come down as acid rain. That will then get into the soil and into bodies of water. And then sulfur can be, after sulfur gets into the soil, it's then taken up by plants. Or it could, if it gets into the water, it can fall down to the bottom of bodies of water. And then layers of sediment can kind of pack it all in, and it gets stuck in rocks. And then it can get out very slowly through the weathering of rocks or through a volcanic explosion or eruption. So when volcanoes erupt, a lot of the gases that they emit are sulfur dioxide. So that's how a lot of sulfur naturally gets into the atmosphere. And then once sulfur in the soil is taken up in by plants, then it goes through the food web. Again, you can see my awesome drawing skills by this mouse, I think that's supposed to be, that blob, and a cat, and then those can decompose into the soil and be stored there. So we also mine and extract compounds that have a lot of sulfur in them, specifically coal. So coal, especially coal that is mined on the eastern part of the country, from the eastern part of the country, has a lot of sulfur in it. And so when we burn that coal in the presence of oxygen in our atmosphere, that tends to create a lot of sulfur dioxide that is then released into the ocean. Or sorry, the atmosphere. The sky is the atmosphere. The ocean is in the water. We also create smaller amounts of sulfur dioxide when we burn other fossil fuels like petroleum products in our cars. So yeah, that's the sulfur cycle, basically. Do you guys have any questions about the sulfur cycle? Did we answer? All right, we have one person who answered our poll down here at the bottom about the ways that nitrogen is fixed in the atmosphere. We'll come back to that later, give you guys a little bit more time. All right, and go on to our last cycle. So this is the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle is different from the other biogeochemical cycles that we've talked about. So it does not have an atmospheric component. All of the other cycles that we talk about in APES have atmospheric components. So the water cycle, which there's a stream on, I believe, next week, and the carbon cycle, the sulfur cycle, the nitrogen cycle, all of those have very significant atmospheric components, but the phosphorus cycle does not. So it's mostly a geological cycle, or it starts off in, so phosphorus is commonly found in rocks. So rocks are weathered, so they're broken down from big rocks into little rocks into teeny tiny sediments, which then can either become part of the soil, so phosphates in the soil, or those little particles of sediment with phosphorus in them can then run off into water. So if the phosphorus gets taken up as part of the soil, then plants can take that up. So plants are taking up that phosphorus. If you guys remember from biology, the DNA backbone in phosphorus, the DNA backbone is a sugar phosphorus compound, phosphate compound. So it's super, super important, and it's a limiting growth factor. So nitrogen and phosphorus are both limiting factors in plant growth. So plants will take up that phosphate from the soil, and then it goes through the food web. So plants to animals to other organisms, because all living things have DNA that they need to carry their genetic material and to make their bodily functions run. And then decomposers would decompose organic matter from plants and animals and redeposit that phosphate in the soil. Or phosphate that's in the soil can become part of runoff. So if you get like a muddy stream running down a hill, so all of those particles, all the phosphate attached to those sediment particles will sink down to the bottom of a body of water and pile up on top of each other and eventually maybe create some sedimentary rocks through sedimentation, where all of those sediments that have phosphorus in them will stick together, get really hard, and then more sediment will pile on top of it and smush it down because it's really heavy, and then create rocks. And then maybe there'll be like a earthquake or something, and that rock that was buried deep below the ground then gets pushed up to the surface, and then it is exposed to rain and wind and all that kind of stuff, and it's broken down and weathered into smaller pieces, and then we start that whole cycle again. So sink for phosphorus is soil and rocks. That's pretty much its only sink. Yeah. And then, of course, because humans are what we are, outside of just interacting with this cycle as an organism that would eat other plants and animals. So I said that phosphates are a limiting factor, growth factor for plants. And so we figured out how to put phosphorus into fertilizers as well. So when we are applying nitrogen fertilizers, a lot of time those fertilizers have phosphorus in them too. And so we are then applying that to the soil so that plants can uptake that and we can grow more plants so that we can feed all of the people that we have on Earth. All right. Somebody asked a question, yay. What is my advice? All right. So let me start answering your question. What is my advice for students who are self-studying for APES? So I think my advice would be to keep attending live streams, because I know I think there's 3 or 4 of us who are streaming for APES so far. So a couple of us are teachers, and then at least one person is somebody who did really well on the APES exam before. So that'll be helpful. And then just keep asking questions, and of the people who might have more expertise. And let's see, what else? Other advice for people self-studying. There's some really great resources out there that like the review books from all the different review companies. They all have really great, concise information. And let's see, and there's some great channels on Vimeo and YouTube as well, of people who have produced video content for APES that is very clearly aligned to what the College Board is asking about. So, Dakota, do you have any other specific questions? Okay, we're gonna go back to our last poll about the ways that nitrogen is fixed out of the atmosphere, and we'll go back to our slide from the nitrogen cycle, just so that that's there. All right, so what's the main way that nitrogen is fixed out of the atmosphere? So is it organisms breathing, super awesome bacteria, or plants doing photosynthesis? So it is those super awesome bacteria that are on the plant roots and hanging out in the soil. When organisms are breathing, that is part of respiration, which is going to contribute more to the carbon cycle. So awesome. But thank you guys so much for participating. All right. Any last minute questions from you guys? All right. So I once had a professor in college about public speaking who said that like 8 seconds was the magic time frame. So, all right. We have another question from Vanessa. All right. You have an APES teacher who has been out since the first day of school, so there hasn't been any content taught in your class yet. Is there somewhere that you should start trying and get some information in? Yeah, there's lots of resources out there. So the streams on Vivable are going to be great resources for you. Like I said, for Dakota. So there is some, Bozeman Science offers some great free resources on YouTube. There's a Vimeo channel called Apes in a Box. I have videos on a YouTube channel that I produce for my high school that are publicly available. So there's, and it's, I think it's RTHS _ Jesse Howington. So there's lots of resources out there. And again, those APES review books from the big companies that do the APES review books, they tend to have pretty concise information. That would be a good way to start getting that information. So does that answer your question, Vanessa? All right, I'll wait my magic 8 seconds and see if anybody else has any other questions. Awesome, good. All right. Okay, so if nobody else has any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and end the broadcast. Thank you to you guys who joined me tonight, and thank you for bearing with me through any technical difficulties and figuring out the streaming platform. And hopefully I will see you guys back here another time, and we'll meet up on social media until then. All right, have a great night, guys.